crisis insinuates an urgent problem, something that you need to fix right now. And when we say that or we think that way, we play into the into the critic's hands of, uh, our identity can collapse. I mean, almost overnight when we play into that narrative. So, as opposed to treating your challenging gospel questions as a crisis, treat it with curiosity, with enthusiasm. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to learn more. And when you take the emotion out of it, and it's just something that you're on a journey. A journey sounds a lot more fun than a crisis.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's episode. I have joining me today Austin Fife, who is the author of the Light and Truth Letter. Austin, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really fun episode for any people who don't know. So Austin has, in the past few months, when did it come out? A couple of months ago, you have a book. You can also get it on PDF format. It's the Light and Truth Letter. There we go. I'm still waiting on my book copy because I like reading the book copy, but I've read it online, so I'll link where people can order the book or read it online. And you've also been on a few different channels. You've been on Ward Radio, Thoughtful Faith, and you and your wife shared your story on the Comeback podcast. And what we're going to do in this interview is we're going to talk about the Light and Truth Letter and talk about your story, your faith journey. In a nutshell, back in 2014, you went through a faith crisis, and then at some point you sort of overcame or resolved some of those issues, came through a faith on the other side, and then you decided to write this document, the Light and Truth Letter, which in a nutshell is a synopsis of positive arguments and evidence in favor for the truth claims of the church, which is sort of being addressed to critics that if the church isn't what it claims to be, if Joseph wasn't a prophet, if the Book of Mormon isn't true, how do you account for this? And then sort of the second half kind of more deals with issues with regards to, is the church good? Social issues like women in the priesthood, LGBT things, some of the positive fruits of religion. So we're going to dive into all that. But why don't we begin with, could you maybe talk a little about like your background and upbringing in the church? Where are you from? Where were you born? What was your family life like? Did you feel like you had a testimony, spiritual experiences? What was just your church life like growing up?
Yeah, and let me say first, that was a beautiful kind of introduction summary to the Light and Truth Letter. Clearly, you've read it. And so just wanted to thank you for doing that. It is free to read online. I've had lots of people order the book, which has been surprising because it's free to read online, but I guess I didn't appreciate how much people, would rather have something physical in their hands. I make virtually no royalties off of the physical book, so I'm not pushing the book. I usually tell people to look at the website.
I think it's good that you offer the free copy as well for people, because there's some books which are very expensive, and there's some people, like, books are kind of expensive as well, especially if you're ordering them, paying for shipping and things. I have a friend from Mexico and they cost a lot more with the exchange rate, so it's good that people can access it online, and you can always read it like chapter, section by section as well.
So I'm probably one of the last people that someone would expect to have a faith crisis. So I grew up in the church. I'm from the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I grew up in the Seattle area, and I was greatly benefited by my upbringing in the church. I had a lot of spiritual experiences. I knew that the church was true. I served a mission. I went to BYU. I mean, I'm kind of like your average, right down the middle sort of member of the church. Mm-hmm. And so, but I did have a faith crisis. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this Light and Truth Letter, because I didn't want to sin. There wasn't I wasn't craving cigarettes or something like that. I didn't want to sin.
Kind of an excuse to justify leaving the church. Nothing
which is not why I think most people leave well, I guess there's pockets of people leave the church. There's some people have always left the church. and that will continue to happen in perpetuity. But there's been this kind of recent rise, and I would say like folks leaving for intellectual reasons, and then even more recent, people leaving for social reasons. And so that's who the letter addresses. It's folks who were faithful as the day is long, and yet they're reading their scriptures, and yet they have a faith crisis. And it's really troubling because it's like, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. And that's the situation I was in when my, I would say, journey 10 years ago started.
I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, because I think growing up in the church, or what I hear a lot of members say, is that there's no good reason for people to leave the church, or if they do leave the church, it's because they weren't praying or
Right.
reading the scriptures, or they just couldn't hack the commandments, or they were
Right.
offended as well. And it wasn't until my own faith crisis that I might have had some of those similar views,
Right.
and recognizing that actually people might leave for legitimate reasons, and it might be intellectual, as you said, social, moral issues as
Yeah.
well. It's not just that they want to sin or they're offended. They're looking for an easy out from the church.
Yeah, I think we do ourselves a disservice as members of the church when we try to like sweep somebody who left the church. We try to brush them under the rug of, oh, they didn't have a testimony, or they didn't uh they didn't want to keep the commandments. I think we do ourselves a disservice because that's not how a lot of them are. And so
Yeah.
when someone like you and I go through something and have a lull in our faith, it can be very awkward and unsettling because it's like if you'd believe those myths, then that can really harm you. And I meant to say this earlier. I love your channel.
Oh, thanks.
Before we got on, I didn't really tell you much, but I don't know how long I followed you, but I followed you for a while, and I really like your style because you give a fair voice to critics and faithful resources alike. And I think in a different alternate universe, this could have been Mormonism with the Fifester or something like that. I just really, your style really resonates with me, and I think, yeah, I not trying to gas you up, but I just, I've always really liked your channel.
Oh, I appreciate that. And hey, in another universe, I would have created probably the Light and Truth ladder. So I may have beaten you to creating the channel, but you beat me to the ladder.
You were busy, that's why I had to do it.
That's true. I was like, down the line, I would love to, but I'm like, there's way too much going on, so like someone else had to do it.
Yeah.
But you were saying before that you felt like you had a testimony. There's some people who grew up in the church and they feel like I've just always believed or known it's true. There was just line upon line little experiences here. Or other people maybe feel like they did have a spiritual experience or like a Mormonized promise where they received a spiritual witness. Did you feel like you were more the first or the latter or a mixture of both?
Yeah, a mixture of both. I just went on a podcast last week where I shared a lot of my spiritual experiences growing up. So again, I'm probably one of the last people you would expect to have gone through a faith crisis. I had an experience in high school where, in the depths of despair, I reached out to God and had some sort of spiritual intervention that I can't exactly explain, but it was uh, really profound and rescued me from the depths of despair. I had a number of miraculous experiences on my mission. I've just I've had a lot of interactions with the divine, but something happens when you go through a faith crisis is your lens changes. Well, I wouldn't say faith crisis, but when you decide that you no longer believe in God, your lens all of a sudden changes, and you then reinterpret these experiences that you've had as something else, some sort of
Right.
psychological misfire or coping mechanism, right? You were in the depths of despair, and so your brain reached out to something greater than yourself so that you could then cope with that problem, right? So you change the lens in which you interpret and view the world, and that changes everything when you change that lens. And that's what I've discovered over the years. And so while I'm one of the last people on planet Earth that maybe should have had a faith crisis, I did, because all the inputs, my spiritual experiences, were being reinterpreted as something else.
I really resonate with that because I feel the same way. And a lot of people will ask when people go through a faith crisis or are having extreme doubts or leave the church, did you not have any spiritual experiences? And there's some people who maybe felt like I didn't have strong spiritual experiences, but there's some people like yourself. I resonate with you that I felt like I really did have strong spiritual experiences, and some could either interpret them as maybe that was God, but that doesn't mean Mormonism is true, or you could go to say maybe this was just coincidence or
Right.
elevation, emotion, or some sort of brain euphoria. You don't deny the experiences, but you reinterpret what they mean.
And so that what we're talking about is, in a sense, the light and truth letter. So that was my explanation for these spiritual experiences, but they did bother me. Like they were, Jared Halverson talks about when you're in the church, you have spiritual exclamation points, and then you have gospel questions, right? Things you don't, challenging gospel questions, things you don't know the answer to. Well, when you leave the church or decide that it's no longer true, those gospel exclamation points should turn into your critical questions.
Hmm.
And so I had gospel exclamation points, things that I knew, experiences I'd had, and those turned into my critical questions, things that bothered me. They haunted me because I couldn't really explain them. So I tried to brush them aside, tried to sweep them under the rug. And it wasn't a very satisfactory answer because I ultimately, deep down, I knew the truth, that this was something else. But again, that's what should happen if you have a faith crisis, is that these things that you once knew should trouble you, right?
So you've shared this on a few other podcasts, but when did your faith crisis begin? What triggered it, and how long would you say it last? And what would you say were some of the main issues that you were struggling with? And then maybe you could describe what it was like going through that
Yeah.
faith crisis as well.
So for years, I thought my faith crisis was because of the problem of evil, and and it's true that certainly played a part in my faith crisis. But I've done a lot of soul searching in the last few months. As I've, when you have to write a letter, you have to kind of confront. Okay, so you have to kind of piece together, how did this all happen? Like
A lot
what
of
led to
reflection.
what? Right. You have to, when you're creating a story, you have to figure out, okay, so what's the story? And I think it wasn't until I started writing the Light and Truth letter, I realized in retrospect, while I thought it was the problem of evil, I think what happened in actuality is I had internalized atheism. What I mean by that is my worldview had subtly and gradually but profoundly changed over the years, where I was treating this life as the end of all existence. And again, it's this like subtle change. And then a couple things happened in the same month. One is it's like my idol, my mentor, somebody I really look up to, former bishop, former high councilman, just like the greatest guy, left the church, and bitterly so. I mean, he burnt every bridge, left his family. Like it was a really big deal. And
Well,
uh, we all have those people where it's like, well, if John knows, then the church has got to be true because John is the best guy ever, right? We all have like our own people we lean on, our heroes, I should say. So I patterned my life after this guy. I want my family to be just like his family. And so when he left, he was gone. It was really troubling because it's like, man, I was like kind of hanging my hat on him, and he's no longer around. That was one. And two was my father-in-law passed away. He was just the best guy. If anyone did not deserve to die, it was him. They weren't in a great financial situation, so with his passing, obviously it made things much worse. He had several kids living at home still. Um, we all have to confront the problem of evil. That was just the catalyst for me. It wasn't so much, oh, bummer, my father-in-law passed away. It got me thinking like, well, our prayers didn't work. What about the starving kids in Africa, who live a life full of misery, and they live a terrible existence and then they die? Do their prayers not matter? That sort of thing. So it was more the catalyst that forced me to confront the problem of evil. And when my father-in-law was passing away, his family was in the hospital room all singing hymns, and I couldn't even be in the same room because I was confronted in that moment. Sometimes we have these experiences where there's a fork in the road and we're confronted with, what do I actually believe? Because you can lose belief and then keep doing your calling and keep kind of plugging along because it's just status quo. But then sometimes you're like pushed up against this decision where it's like, oh, what do I actually believe? And it was in that moment in December of 2013, as his family is around him singing hymns and he's passing on into the next life, that I go, I don't believe he's going to be here anymore. I believe he's gone
Wow.
and we'll never see him again. And so that's when I realized, oh, I no longer believe, and I didn't even realize. And
And at
so
this point, was a lot of this just internal? It sounds like you were just struggling with the problem of evil and just how you were living your life, but internally as well. Like, were you listening to much like any atheist sort of content or books? At this point, had you been listening to any critical information or stumbling across controversial things in church history, or is this really where it began with struggles with God and the problem of evil?
yeah, it was struggles with God and the problem of evil. I started noticing and following content on social media around atheism, around the same time. But when my father-in-law passed away, again, all of a sudden that lens changed, where I was like, oh, I actually don't believe that there's a God. And once that lens had changed, when I was younger, I was just naive. I was just a kid, didn't know anything about seer stones or you name it. I didn't know anything. And then right before my mission, I was like, oh, I really want to be like, know my stuff and be able to like answer any question. So then I started looking into controversial things with this like apologist lens, right? I'm going to defend the faith. And so what you do with that is you maximize faithful resources and you minimize critical resources. That's what you do with that lens. But then in that moment, when my father-in-law passed away, all of a sudden my lens changed overnight. And so now all of a sudden the critics had all the answers. They were the ones telling the truth. The apologists, the defenders of the faith, they were the liars. And the church, they were the liars. And it was literally overnight where now I'm maximizing the critical narratives and minimizing the faithful narratives. And so I lived in that mindset for a number of weeks, at least a couple of months. And I wear my heart on my sleeve. I can't like keep anything in. It's probably really annoying to be married to me. I, I just
Yes, it's
can't
good in a
like,
way, communication.
yeah, that's true.
Maybe
My
too
wife and I
much,
are
like.
we're good communicators if nothing else. And so it was a few short weeks after this. My wife was in the living room. We just put our 1-year-old son down to bed. And I just told her, I said, I don't think that there's a God. And I said I don't think, but I was pretty sure. I
Mhm.
was I was like
Soften the
I
language
don't
there.
yeah, I don't think that there's a God. Um and this is essentially the framing of the Light and Truth letter. She thought for a moment. She didn't panic. She didn't get defensive. She thought for a moment and she said, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because this is where I found the most light and truth. And if you can find more light and truth outside the church, I will follow you. And that framing changed everything.
A
And
very
here's why.
profound and mature response
Yeah.
coming from her.
Here's how it changed everything. Before my mission, I had this, and after my mission, I had this lens of the church has to be true. And then during my faith crisis, I had the lens of the church has to be false. But when she invited me to find something that was more true and had more light, all of a sudden, I mean, I can't say I'd had no lens, but all of a sudden, I didn't need to protect a narrative. The church didn't have to be true, and it didn't have to be false either. My only mission was, where can I find the most light and truth? And that changed everything. So all of a sudden, instead of this being a really emotional thing where I'm maximizing or minimizing certain narratives, it turned into, what is the information? What's the data? What's the history say? And let's dig into that. Let's dive deep into that. and see what it says. So all of a sudden, I started treating these controversial issues with just curiosity and enthusiasm. It was really interesting to me. And this is, I think, one area where I really like your channel, where I feel like you give equal voice to critical voices and faithful voices. You ask, faithful people come on your channel who are a faithful resource. You'll ask them some critical questions like, what do you say about this thing? So you have this understanding of kind of all the different issues. And that's why I really like your channel. But that's kind of how my faith journey started, where I removed the lenses and now it was just like, okay, I'm the father of my family. I'm my wife's husband. She's counting on me to lead us and preside. So, what is more true and has more light than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And I was in that mindset for years and years. And the Light and Truth Letter is my 10-year check-in point. It's not the capstone. I'm not done learning. I'm not done seeking. I'm not done searching, but it's my 10-year check-in.
Right. That's super interesting. So it seemed like after that conversation with your wife, that almost caused you to be like, I'm just going to explore and listen and figure things out, look at the data, listen to both sides. So maybe
Yeah.
before then, you said that you were very skeptical about apologists, that they're either dishonest or it's all mental gymnastics. And it seems after that that you're willing to give both sides a fair shake. At what point did you feel that you were starting to come through with belief on the other side? Because
Yeah.
sometimes you can go through a process where you feel like, like you said before, the church is all true, 100% true. There's no doubts. It's all just wonderful and beautiful. And then you can go, oh, it's obviously not true. It's clearly false. Then you can go through a period where it's like, maybe it feels more false than true, but there's some good evidence in favor. It can feel a bit 50-50. When
Yeah.
did you start to feel like belief was starting to reconstruct again?
Yeah. So I think some people, their testimony of Joseph Smith in the Restoration gets shaken, and then that leads them to no longer believe in God. That wasn't the case with me. For me, it really was, if there's no God, then much less of Jesus Christ, much less of
That's
Church
true,
of Jesus
yeah.
Christ. Right.
And that was the first thing. So if you lose belief in God, it's like, well, yeah, none of this stuff about the witnesses really matters. It's all obviously not true.
Yeah, I was completely indifferent to the church. During that period when I had accepted my critical lens wholeheartedly, I could care less about the church and church history and that sort of thing. Um, but after this point, once I no longer was trying to protect a narrative, I was just learning, just with curiosity, not just trying to tear down the church, but trying to just explore God first. And I make it seem like it's sequential. It's not sequential. It's like you're learning everything all at once, right? It's
Yeah,
it's all happening at the same time, right?
it is. Yeah.
Um, but the first major breakthrough I had was a few months later when, so in a completely unrelated, so I talk about this in the letter a little bit. I realized I'd internalized atheism. I was treating this life as it were the end of all existence. And when you think about, if you're a believing Latter-day Saint, you believe there's an afterlife versus you're an atheist and believe this is the end, like that dramatically impacts the way you behave, right? It has a significant impact. And so that's the way I was manifesting and living my life. But I had somebody said a phrase that would change my life forever. And it's an innocuous phrase. Like, this sounds like nothing, but I'm really big about one-liners. Like one-liners, they'll just kind of rattle around in my brain for a long time. And I don't know. I'm a big fan of one-liners for whatever reason. But somebody in an unrelated setting said, "Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us." And I thought about that. It was like a Joseph Smith, James 1:5 moment where I thought about that constantly, like over and over and over. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Because there's all these terrible, hostile, awful, nasty things that happen in this life. Even if you're like, you live in the UK, you live in America, middle class, and things go pretty well for you and you live a long, healthy, happy life, everyone around you, will die, right? You will die, you will get sick or die young. And so this life, by definition, is misery and suffering, even if you live in like a really privileged country. And so we all are going to go through it at some point, no matter who you are, no matter where you live. And so this thought, death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. I go, oh, if there is a God, then, and you know, there's like eternities, like living from all eternity to all eternity. If that's true, then this life would be like, I mean, barely a
Any glimpse?
blip.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be, yeah, be a glimpse, right? It would barely be anything. And so then I was thinking, okay, so what if this God like proposed some plan of like, okay, I'm going to create, and I call it the agency machine, is what I call it. Um, I'm going to create this agency machine where my children, you can go down and there's no guarantees, absolutely no promises. You could, from the moment you're born, live in misery and suffering and die tragically young and starve, have diseases. I mean, you don't know what hand you're going to get. Uh, Sign on this dotted line. Do you consent to experience this mortal existence and gain a body and have experiences for yourself and like live on your own? And probably all of us were like, no, that sounds terrible. I don't want to do that. But then God said, listen, I'm going to provide a savior for you, somebody who's going to make it all right so that you can return, have a body. By the way, I'm doing this as an atheist. If you noticed anything, I'm like reconstructing the gospel story from
Mm.
the ashes of my disbelief. And so finally, I realized, okay, if there's a God, then he would need to provide a Messiah, um, to make it all right. Because how can he be all knowing, all loving, all good, and we suffer so much in this life? Well, if we consented to it, we said, I consent, I'll do that. I'll enter this random, chaotic agency machine, but you need to make it up to me. And he makes it up to us by providing this redeemer, the savior who knows what we go through, who makes up for our shortcomings and imperfections. And, you know, because somebody could rape somebody else, and that person who got raped, they now suffer the consequences for the rest of their lives and
Yeah.
perpetually multi-generational. Like we're talking
A lot of
trauma
trauma.
upon trauma. Well, what if the rapist all of a sudden, you know, comes to Jesus at the end of their lives? Like, how can they possibly make up for all the intergenerational damage that they've caused? They can't. And so there has to be some sort of price paid to make up for the injustices that we suffer in this blip. All this to say, for the first time, I realized, oh, death is not the worst thing that can happen to, if the gospel's true, if there is a God, then death wouldn't be the worst thing that could happen to us. There are much worse things that could happen to us. And so it's not that I believed all of a sudden, it was more I could see how I could believe. It finally I saw like a path forward. And so I was like, okay, I could see how this works. So once I have established that, then all of a sudden I could kind of tackle the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the truth claims and the church history. And so that part of it was somewhat linear and sequential. I had to like figure out my relationship with God. Like, how can I make him work logically? And once I established that, then I could kind of move on to everything else.
And
Oh,
then, oh, sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to answer finally your question. So
I don't remember
once
what it
I,
was.
well, so once I had established that baseline, then I could kind of treat church history with eagerness and curiosity. Okay, so how does this whole church thing work? And it was really weird. It was like missionary Austin was teaching investigator Austin. It was awesome. Um, and so now I'm deep diving in it, and I'm like going down endless rabbit holes. You know what I'm talking about, where you've got really like uh negatives, let's say, against the restoration's truth claims, but then you've got some good answers too. And then you've got like some really neat evidences and some good counterpoints. And you kind of go back and forth and endlessly down this rabbit hole where I found myself at one point months later, I was just like, man, I think it's like a coin toss. Like this could totally be false or totally be true. And it feels like it's about 50-50. And
That's
it was when
awful
I
when you're wrestling in the middle, because what I found much easier was when, prior to my faith crisis, where I was like, I know this is 100% true. I know that the Book of Mormon is true. Joseph was a prophet. This is the Lord's restored church. Church history is like the 2005 Joseph Smith movie. The plan of salvation's wonderful. And the gospel and the church just felt like the Garden of Eden. And
right,
it was just, there was no real doubt. I never had any issues or any reasons not to believe. And then vice versa, whenever I lost my faith, I kind of flip-flopped where I went from feeling like it's
right.
100% all not true. And that also felt kind of nice because I felt like really sure, except for maybe certain spiritual experiences, but in terms of like the data and the information. But then the awful part was when you feel torn and conflicted because on the one hand, you might be like, okay, the critics have a good argument on this topic or issue, but then this kind of undermines it. But then what I do with this evidence over here, and then when you feel sure, oh no, the church is true, what about some of this stuff? And that can be almost harder when you feel conflicted and there's so many things going on.
Yeah. And so you go down this like endless rabbit hole. And I had an important realization. I think from the Holy Ghost. I don't think whether it's me or the Holy Ghost, the church it mattereth is false or true.
Judgy.
I don't think I can prove that. If there is a God, I don't think that I can prove that I have to make a decision or true because deciding that the church is 100% false, like and you just said, if there is a God, is a belief, then right, that's a step into that I have to make a kind of ignore and minimize because deciding that the church is 100% false. Same thing. If the church is true, you have to ignore and minimize some things to make that work. That's a step. Either one was a step to kind of ignore and minimize some things to make that narrative having a belief, right? Same thing. If the church is true, you have to take the challenge from some things to make that Book of Alma. So either one was a step into the dark. I would was a experiment upon the word. Having decided, you know what? I'm going to become I decided to take the challenge. I don't know that this is Book of Alma. I have no idea. That I would experiment upon the word, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to become a believer. I don't know that this is true. I have no idea, but I am going to believe that it's true. And perhaps if I decide to believe, then if there is a God, he can do something with that. So that was an idea that I had. Again, could have been from the Holy Ghost, but that was a thought I had that I'm never going to prove the church true or false. But maybe if I make a decision, then he could do something with me. Because if you're moving in a direction, he could reorient you. And so that's what I decided a few months later that I would become a believing member of the church. And Stephen, it was awesome. I loved it because I didn't know anything. But I believed, and there's something sincere about that. There's something raw and vulnerable and I think beautiful about being a believing member of the church. And the gospel became new and exhilarating to me in ways that I couldn't have possibly imagined because of this decision that, yeah, I don't know anything, but I believe that this is true. And that made for me all the difference. And so the scale that's 50-50, it's changed over the years. But I've never regretted that decision to become a believing member of the church. And yeah, I mean, that's my story.
So much of that resonates, like, because I feel the same way in a lot of ways that you have like this epistemic humility. And I too don't use the language or I know. But even throughout the scriptures, like, yes, of course, we have Moroni 10, verse 5, by the power of the Holy Ghost, you may know the truth of all things. But throughout the scriptures, like, a very common message is like, fear not, only believe. And like, faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. And sometimes when people bear testimony at church, it can be a little bit triggering for you. Sometimes people say, I don't just believe, I know without any shadow of a doubt, almost that like knowing superior to believe.
Right.
But I think God is just as much pleased if you believe, because for some people, I know like with my own faith and testament, I imagine it was probably the same with yours growing up. I would have felt like I absolutely knew and that my testimony was really strong. But then there was like no books on the shelf. And it's like true faith like you don't know if you truly have faith until it is tested and shaken. And although you may not have the same absolute certainty as you once did, it is a shelf or a faith that is more thoughtful, more robust, that's been challenged, that's had many books on it as well, but it's been strengthened and fortified. And something you said about that you feel you couldn't prove the church is true or false, almost like it's like there's evidence and reasons to believe and things not to believe. And this might be a good transition into your letter. I remember whenever I had my conversation with Terrell Givens, I listened to him in a podcast and he articulated this beautifully. Like I'd felt this for years, but no one had articulated it until I listened to him. He said that it almost seems like it's the design of this life, like opposition in all things. Like believing, it almost seems like gravity isn't a belief. It's just like self-evident. It's just like a fact. Like if you drop something, it's going to fall and hit the ground. Like, so it's not a sign of virtue, a moral virtue for you to believe in gravity. It's just obvious. And if someone were
Yeah.
to say, like, I'm going to give you £1 million if you believe in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, it's like you couldn't do it. But he said it seems when it comes to like believing in God, the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, Jesus's resurrection, it's like on the one hand, there's so many reasons and evidence and arguments to believe, but it almost seems like by design that there's also opposing reasons to doubt, to disbelieve. And I have resonated with you. There's been parts of my journey on certain topics. I'm like, man, there's so much good evidence and arguments to believe. But then with others, it's like, but then there's still some issues here on this side. And if you only
Right.
focus on one, you'd be 100% convinced it's either true or not true. And sometimes when you take it all together, it can be confusing and complex. And in a way, in some ways, you kind of have to make a choice which you're most persuaded by and what you're going to put your faith in as well, to an extent.
Right.
And I think as well, it's not always going to be 50-50 on every topic and throughout
Right.
your life. Like whenever I first was down my rabbit hole, it didn't feel like 50-50 at the time. But then as I was encountering some apologetic stuff and then coming back to the church and done more research, then things tend to balance out again.
Right.
So anyway, I think what was then your motivation for writing the letter? Before we get into your letter, what was it that motivated you that I want to write this Light and Truth letter?
Yeah, a number of things. I felt like in this world of, we'll call it apologetics, I felt like we needed something like this. I I was kind of amazed. It's been 11 years since the CES letter was published in April of 2013. Is that right? Yeah, April 2013 is when it was
Something about
published.
that. Yeah.
And I, sincere critics who know what they're talking about, they know that it's not particularly scholarly. It's not particularly well done. There's a lot of really flawed argument. It's not to say everything's like garbage. Like there's some good things in there too. But
Yeah, I agree with
like
that.
people who know what they're talking about know that it's not good scholarly research, but it's incredibly effective.
Yes.
So that to this day, 11 years later, it's still, even these critics who know better, they still use it as like their rallying flag, their title of liberty. And I was thinking, I was like, why is that? And so then I kind of became a student of the CES letter. And I was thinking, I was like, I think that the reason this is so effective is because it tells a story. Um, and we as humans, we love stories. We resonate with stories. We insert ourself into a certain story, and a story about a faithful, lifelong member who just had some questions he wanted answered, like that really resonates with people. And so no matter like the bogus arguments of the CES letter, it's resonates with people and still incredibly effective because it tells a story. So that's kind of where it started. I was like, man, I wish we as members of the church had like a story of somebody who left the church and then came back with like all of their questions when they were outside the church or didn't believe. And like I said earlier, and that's when I realized, oh, I think I've got to write this thing. And
I agree
so
because I think one of the things that is very compelling about the CS letter, and what I would say about the CS letter is really Jeremy, he's sort of drawing upon a lot of like Mormon think,
mhm,
Grant Palmer, the Tanner. So not much of it is original, but what he did, it was very condense this synthesis, almost you could say a gish gallop of just a
Yeah.
lot of criticism and overwhelming the reader with
Right.
just all these questions. And at the time, even if you're like, maybe I'll try to answer this or answer that, I felt this whenever I was in my faith crisis, lost my faith. And a lot of people who lose their faith, they will often say, like, there's just so many issues. There's too many issues. Even if you can kind of resolve one or two,
Right.
there's just way too many issues for it to be true. And what I find quite ironic about your letter, the way you wrote it, is that you can make the same argument as a believer or an apology. Like from
Right.
reading your letter, there's so many arguments or positive evidence in favor. And I would say, like, yeah, it's a fallacy argument to say, oh, there's so much, so it means it must be true. We would say, as believers or apologists, you need to examine each criticism, each topic, weigh it up, and then look at it collectively because that is what they would say probably to your letter or whenever I did my top 10 evidences video, they would say, well, we need to examine each one to see if it's really that strong,
Right.
then look at it collectively. But oftentimes that is what I think is so effective about the CS letter. And it's very easy as well to ask a question or to make an allegation. And it's really hard to research, to contextualize it, to find anything that might undermine and challenge it. And I think that's why it's very effective. And a lot of I think apologetics is predominantly defensive. It's always
Right.
playing defense. And that's sort of what was enlightening to me in my Book of Mormon series was that actually there's some solid evidence or positive reasons in favor, where it's like, how do you account for this? And that was one thing I liked about the tone of your letter is that it was like, how do you account for all this? Asking critics a bunch of hard questions.
Right. Yeah. One of the pieces of feedback I've gotten is like, you're not like fairly treating all of the issues. And it's like, I know, this isn't a treatise on, this isn't a 3,000 page book on all of the best arguments for and against the church and a deep dive. That's not what the letter is. This is a reaction to critics.
Mm.
Uh,
And it wasn't
it,
to answer every single thing in the
no.
CS letter, because that was going to be one of my questions. Because there's been different responses, like Jim Bennett's or Michael Ash or Fair.
Yeah.
So that wasn't your intention. You addressed some things and contextualized, but for the most part, it was more, well, how do you account for this?
Yeah. It's like, these were things that troubled me and bothered me when I was thinking about leaving the church. And that's what the letter is. I never say this is like a comprehensive summary of all the best arguments for and against. And I think in the church, what we've done is, there's like the CES letter and other things like it. And then we have to write a library of books to answer, like one question from the CES letter. We have to have a whole fair conference dedicated to one of the topics. Um, and and so sometimes our responses, and by the way, those debunkings, they're all really important. This is more like they've got it, like they're on it, so I don't have to do that
It's
because they've
necessary.
done a.
You need to have defensive
You have
apologetics. You
to,
need
yeah,
to address it. Which, on the flip side, we would probably argue as well for critics is like you also need to address some of these positive arguments and
right,
evidence in favor as well.
yeah, exactly. And so that's where I felt like there was a need in this world for something like the Light and Truth letter that's just asking questions of critics. And there are like dozens of Reddit threads with hundreds of comments. And so I think it's been very effective in asking good questions. And I've gotten some really good feedback. So, some things I'm going to change in the second edition, but I've gotten some good feedback from critics like, this is smart. Like this undermines the credibility of the CES letter
Yes.
by turning it on its head. Which yeah, it's exposing something about the CES letter for sure. Yeah.
Like you're making a point as opposed to proving a point, because it's not that every single question there proves, Joseph is a prophet, the church is true, but it's to do basically the reverse of what the CS letter did and sort of using the same strategies as well. But I still think that a lot of the arguments and points, particularly, I really enjoyed the first half on very much the truth claim section on the Book of Mormon, witnesses, things like the Book of Enoch and Angel and Temple Rise, because I've been sort of researching some of this as well. And it was interesting to see it all synthesized and just bombarded. And I was thinking myself, like, if I were to leave the church, I have to account for all this intellectually. I know some people would say it's the burden of proof isn't on unbelievers, but I feel like if you're seeking truth and evidence, you need to account for the positive things in favor as well.
Well, and in the second half of the letter are, the benefits of being a member of the church. So I think if you're going to take somebody out of the church, then you better be sure, right? You better be 100% sure that it's false if you're going to take people out. And so the first, here's the way I think of it: critics who use manipulative techniques and tactics, like Jeremy Reynolds does in the CES letter, what they're trying to do is paint you into a corner where you feel like there's no way out. You're like, your whole identity collapses in front of you. And then all of a sudden you start saying things like, there's no way that I could believe. Anytime I hear somebody say that, I say, that's not you speaking. That's a critic. You're parroting a critic because they've painted you into this corner where you feel like there's nothing left. It's totally false. There's no way that I could believe. And so I think what the first half of the Light and Truth letter is trying to do is just put down a few tiles so you can find stable ground going, okay, the story is more complicated than, again, not definitively true, but the story's, there's more to the story than critics led me to believe. And they do use some manipulative techniques and tactics. And oh, I see what the critic was doing there when they said XYZ. And so it helps just provide some clarity to the situation. And I'm perfectly fine somebody having left the church, they read the Light and Truth letter, they're still not convinced and they stay out. That's fine.
Yeah.
That'll happen, of course. But for those people who are in the church who are going through a faith crisis, or even former members who have left who miss things about the church, but they've said there's no way I could believe. I hope what this does is it opens up this path to where they could say, oh, okay, I could see how I could believe, and now I can engage without a lens, right? That's kind of my hope with that first half in particular.
Mm. And we'll often hear like critics like John DeLynn say, and I agree with this approach or this goal about informed consent. I think we should try to inform people as much about information. What's different is that, for example, I don't think the CS letter is giving fully informed consent on different issues. And it's hard to fully inform people.
Right.
But whenever I was out of the church, I didn't encounter any apologetic evidences until maybe like a month or two before, when I first started to like come across channels like LDS Truth Claims or listen to some fair conferences. Like I'd heard of fair,
Right.
but coming across like ancient temple rites, some correspondences to Iron Diamond, or like the Book of Enoch, or like just how well old world geography converged. And it was like, or all like the first and second hand statements of the witnesses. And I was like, I'd never heard any of this from
Right.
critics. And there might be, unless they've dived really deeply into apologetics, I reckon a lot of what's in your Light and Truth ladder, probably a lot of people who have left may not be fully aware of. So in a way, it's good to inform those people. And if they're still not convinced, at least they know, and at least they might have more understanding to why somebody believes. Because I think
Yeah.
it's very tempting whenever I left or whenever I've had family members leave and I've returned back. You can almost feel a little bit of frustration, like, why do you still believe? It's so obvious.
Right.
It's not true. Look at all these reasons. And that's a very good way to say, these are some positive arguments I find in favor. It's not the foundation for my faith, but they intellectually reinforce my spiritual
Right.
belief. And unless you have debunking answers to it, then these are some good reasons why.
Yeah. And things like that. Like, it's obviously a fraud. It's like, that's not you speaking. Like, if you really are taking all of the evidence, it should make sense why somebody is a believer, and you don't agree with them, but at least you get it.
Yeah.
Um, I was gonna say something. I don't. I
Oh, that's
lost
okay.
track.
That's okay. So what I was thinking that we could transition to do next, because we've been talking a lot generally about your letter.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's over 200 pages, and there's a
Yeah.
lot in that. There's so many questions. So, but maybe we could hit a few points, things that I liked about your letter, and maybe you could just summarize in a couple of minutes, maybe certain arguments or certain points. I've also copy and pasted certain questions. I think the questions are some of the best parts of it because you'll present an argument or a bit of evidence, but the questions, I think questions are very effective So some things that stood out to me. So unless your thought comes back to it, the first section, which was something that was quite unique that I hadn't heard many other apologists bring up, is like fallacies or tactics
Hmm.
critics use. Now you have a lot of them in the table, but is there maybe one or two you'd like to present where maybe over time you began to feel a bit disillusioned with critics, or you began to maybe see a bit of like bias on their side, or
Yeah.
even maybe go so far as like a bit of manipulation? Was there one or two that maybe you'd want to share?
Yeah, I've got my notes right here, and I've written down a handful. One of them is the myth of infallibility,
Mm,
where, and this is kind of an interesting thing, where critics take the position that church leaders should be infallible or near infallible. Now, they never say it in those words, but it's heavily implied in their criticism that church leaders should be infallible or nearly infallible. And in their defense, a lot of members of the church believe that. And maybe they believed it when they were outside the church,
that's
right?
what I believed growing up
Right.
as well. And I can't say I ever had a lesson where I was taught prophets were infallible. It was just believed or assumed.
Yeah.
I had these assumptions that like every week the prophet went to the Holy of Holies and he met and
Right.
communed with Jesus. So like the conference talks is like the literal words of Christ. And it definitely wouldn't have been part of my worldview or paradigm that prophets could not just make moral mistake. I knew that they were humans, but like theological or doctrinal
Right.
mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. And so critics take advantage. Oh, I remember my point from earlier.
Oh, go ahead. It's probably a
I'm
good
going
one.
to say it now.
Yeah, go.
Critics take advantage of a natural limitation in the church. We're not going to spend our precious Sunday time doing apologetics. There's not
Mm,
that much time that we're all together, and we need to spend it talking about faith, repentance, baptism, and serving our neighbor, and that's what we need to spend the time doing. And so in church, we hear Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon through the gift and power of God, and then on to the next point. And do critics think we're going to spend like weeks every year going, well, Martin Harris said this about the translation, and but David Whitmer, he said this about the seer stone, and maybe he used it toward the end of the translation, or maybe he just used it as a demonstration. We're not going to do that and go into the primary resources because that's not what church is for. That's not like what we do there. And so critics are really smart. They expose this natural weakness and they say the church never told me. The
mm.
church was lying to me when certainly there are things that get minimized in our history and things that get emphasized and reiterated over and over, right? That certainly is the case. But I give this example in the book. Like, when I was a kid, I loved watching baseball. I watched hundreds of hours of baseball, but I don't remember them talking about baseball's questionable past with racism and drug usage and scandals and all the different things behind baseball history. And I'm glad I didn't because I was just trying to watch baseball. And so that's the way that I see the church is that the church isn't there to be an apologetics organization. We do need these other organizations and arguments do need to be put forward, but the critics expose this natural weakness that we're not going to spend weeks every year debating seer stones versus the Urim and Thummim. That was kind of my point I
But
wanted to
there's a
address
lot
earlier.
of complexity to that issue because I was going to ask you this question later on. So since we're on the topic, because on the one hand, I feel like this is a really nuanced point because some people would say that the church has lied or I'll use language not been maybe fully forthright about controversial things in its history. And I think certainly when it comes to like polygamy, after the manifesto, the church is very much like we're not the FLDS, and I think Emmanuel's we are very much like de-emphasizing let's not talk about plural marriage,
Right.
let's not get into let's just focus on the passages about celestial marriage in Doctrine and Covenants
Or Joseph
32.
Smith, in his 1838 account of the first vision, he emphasized the Urim and Thummim and not the seer stone. So it's only a
Right, right.
matter of time before details get forgotten. But I mean, the saints reverenced the seer stone, during his life and after his death. And so that's an issue with just church history is certain things get canonized or emphasized, and then other things kind of get forgotten. It gets, history is
Yeah,
is messy.
that's what makes it messy because with the seer stone, like I think when it comes to like people like Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, they were aware of some of the Seer Stone accounts, but they thought they were erroneous or hearsay,
Right.
not credible. So it's not like they intentionally hid it, but they interpret it as it's not credible. And then whenever I first learned about the Seer Stone, I did feel a bit like, oh, why didn't I learn that in seminary? I think it's good that like it's incorporated more into the maybe seminary or institute. There's more gospel topics essays, but there's actually a lot of complexity because I read Neville Lucas's book, and they're very much pushing back on the Seer Stone narrative because all the
Right.
sources that I've been presented by critics is like from Emma and like Martin Harris, David Whitmer,
Yeah. David Whitmer.
Joseph Knight Sr., Michael Moore's talking about a seer stone. And then they're like, but Oliver and Joseph just mentioned Urim and Thummim were the Nephite interpreters. So then I was like a sado one Christmas and I ordered this book, Opening the Heavens, and it was a great resource. It had like 200 documents on Book of Mormon translation, and I like accumulated about 60 or 70 into a video. And there's lots of complexity because there's some that talk about Urim and Thummim, there's some that talk about interpreters in a hat, some seer stone in a hat. Some say no, it was the Urim and Thummim, then the seer stone, but then after they lost the 116 pages, Joseph and Oliver talk about interpreters. So it's very complex and not easy to reconstruct. This is exactly
So
the mode of
so
translation.
I have a solution. What if we say Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God? And that's what we say. And then we move on to, okay, we need to serve our neighbors, we need to help sister such and such move. And so critics are really smart. They know what they're doing. They're exposing this natural weakness that we have in the church. And so we need these faithful resources. The church is very it's open to kind of the Joseph Smith papers and everything else. And yeah, maybe that should have been more open earlier. Like you can have that argument, but I mean, for
And
a
on the
church that's
flip side,
yeah,
this is where I think it's very nuanced because on the one hand, I think it's legitimate. Like I remember someone telling me about Joseph using a rock and a hat on my mission and being like, "You don't know what you're talking about. I grew up in the church my whole life, and it was the plates with the Urim and Thummim." And then learning about Seerstone when I got home, I did feel a bit disheartened. But then on the flip side, whenever I first learned about the witnesses in the church, I'd only read the official testimony of the three and the eight. And
yeah,
whenever I read like Grant Palmer's book or Mormon Think or the CS Ladder, you're presented with like a handful of what are now second or third hand accounts. But at the time, I was like, oh, this is what they really claimed. But actually,
right.
when you go deeper, there's loads of first and second hand accounts, around 150 for the three witnesses that Richard Lloyd Anderson presented. And I never learned about any of those at church either.
Right.
So on the one hand, the church's primary goal or function isn't history. I think they should incorporate more, and I think that they are doing that. But if you're going to say that they intentionally hid some of those troubling aspects, there's also some very faithful things like the Book of Enoch or Old World geography, which I didn't learn about at church either.
Alma 36, right?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I do agree with you that I think there's a lot of nuance to this. On the one hand, I wish the church implemented a bit more church history and that they were more forthright and there is more transparency. But that's not the church's primary goal is apologetics. And it's not like you would say the church intentionally hid evidence in favor. It's like that's not what the church is trying to do.
Right. It seems like they're focused on a different mission than just constantly proving that it's true, right? They're focused on something else.
Hmm.
But yeah, just like you said, there are lots of things I had no idea about until this journey started. Jacob Hansen, in my interview with him, well, was it my interview with him? I think it was. He talked about, if you enter this apologetics world, it's like this whole new world. It's like this whole different thing in the church. So buckle up, like if you're going to enter it, because it's like this totally different thing. And again, I believe that the church is true because of a lot of these things and other experiences that I've had. But it's like a totally different world. You could be a lifelong member and have no clue what you're getting yourself into in this kind of new world.
Right. No, I totally agree. It does feel like this new world of controversy and criticism, scholarship, apologetics. And on the one hand, because I feel like now I'm sort of in this space, you do a lot of research, you're reading books, you're constantly listening to podcasts. I'm grateful that my church experience is more devotional. It's more focused upon
Yeah.
the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's like, oh man, I need to repent and be a disciple and those sorts of things. On the other hand, I want to get your thoughts on this. because I think the church has great resources for like, you know, people who are struggling like with addiction, for example, and they have
Right.
addiction recovery programs and almost like extra classes to support people. This is my personal opinion. I think it would be great if there was some sort of a class offered at like the stake level, not necessarily mandatory, but like something similar to like Brett McDonald's LDS Truth Claim series, or like some sort of like
Right.
gospel topics class, something either like faith crisis oriented or like defending the faith for people who either come out of seminary or institute, or it's welcome to all members to be more informed in these topics. Because in one way, I feel like my faith crisis, it may not have been like avoided, but I don't think I would have left the church had I encountered maybe some of those classes or like a class like Brett
Right.
McDonald's. And I'm not saying like you should turn seminary or institute, because I was teaching
Right.
Sunday school for a bit and I didn't feel comfortable. Like I'd brought in some things like apologetic wise, but only for a few minutes of the lesson. I didn't feel like I should make the lesson like about apologetics. I think you talk about that as well in your letter. But on the flip
Yeah.
side, I think it would be great if there was some sort of a class like that in the stake to like, let's look at the positive evidence, let's address criticisms, and then people from there, if they're really interested, they can be a nerd and dive in deeply, but they'd
Right.
be informed, or like listen to a lot of David Snell's faith and beliefs videos. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we shouldn't. I don't think this is something we should get into in our Sunday school and priesthood lessons. Again, not because we're hiding anything, but there's just more important things to talk about
Yeah.
that we need to cover. I was a seminary teacher for a couple of years, and I was really excited to inoculate my students against, claims that the church never taught me X, Y, Z. But it became apparent really quickly that my seminary students didn't need it at all. That they needed to hear that they're a treasured child of God, that God loves them, that they can repent, that they can receive forgiveness, that Jesus is their savior and redeemer. And so I quickly learned teaching seminary that this is not what we should focus on. Now, your point is, should there be like a self-reliance esque type class where you do apologetics? I think it could be. I I lived in a ward when the gospel topics essays started coming out. Our bishop would spend like fifth Sundays, like covering, a handful that the bishopric would cover a handful of topics from the gospel topic essays. I think that's awesome. I
Mhm.
know stakes have put on like, firesides where they address some of these sort of things. And so the short answer is the church is doing it, but it's on a stake level. So then the real question is, should the church have some sort of like overarching, like a self-reliance apologetics type program? That I don't know the answer to. I think sure. Sure. I think it could potentially.
Awesome.
Sorry,
Uh,
I have a boring answer. Sure.
no, yeah, because that's the thing. Because then if it's church wide, it would very much depend on like, would it be like a correlated sort of class or curriculum? It depend on getting someone to teach it. But I think it could be something awesome, perhaps. But that's obviously up to the church and local stakes. But here,
Right.
would you mind if we dived a little bit in to certain things in your letter for the next, say, half an hour, so that we have?
Yeah, and one more thing, you talked about different fallacies. I only shared one,
Oh
the
yes, yes.
myth of infallibility. I'll give you just one other one that I think is really important. Bulverism, which is poisoning the well. Um, Critics will say, you can't trust that BYU study because, they're paid by the church,
Right.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
can't trust fair. They're just apologists, right? And I noticed that right away when the Light and Truth letter came out on Reddit. There was this like need and desire for bulverism, to poison the well. It's like, oh,
What about you?
these are your typical dishonest apologetics. And there was like this desperate need to like dismiss as quick as you can and point arrows like bad, bad, bad. And that's something definitely I saw in the critic. And we do it in the church too. It's like
Yeah,
those
it kind of annoys
nonsense,
me that.
yeah, the nonsense anti-Mormon arguments, deceptive, right? We do it in the church too, and that's something people have said, like the church doesn't do these things. I'm like, my letter's not written to the church. My my letter's written to the critics, and certainly we as members of the church sometimes succumb to these sort of fallacies, but it's definitely there among critical circles. And so I hope that somebody encountering these arguments, they can go, oh, I see what they're doing, and then
Yeah.
engage in critical thinking so that then they can rationally evaluate the evidences without some of these filters and lenses.
Yeah, because I often will hear that like, oh well, these are church-sponsored apologists, and their
Right.
salary depends on defending the church and producing scholarship. And I don't like it when critics argue that. But I also did a video kind of defending critics who have podcasts where they're making a living out of it, and people attack them for
Yeah.
earning lots of money from it. Like, yeah, you should obviously take that into account. But I wouldn't just say, oh well, they're putting out YouTube content, they're doing it for money, because like all of us here in this space are putting out videos and getting some sort of money from it. So I feel like it's
Yeah.
like an irrelevant argument in a way, you
Yeah.
know?
So I'll push back slightly, less than you probably imagine. I actually feel almost exactly the same. Like people are up in arms that John Dehlin makes whatever 250,000 a year, from his nonprofit as the CEO and owner. That
But
doesn't bother me.
it's also like I'll just say this is like don't be naive to think that his salary also depends on like if he suddenly like stopped criticizing the church, like that's his
Right.
salary and that's what he's making a living out of as well. So it goes both ways as well. So don't be naive that
Yeah.
he's also
So
got his salary from what he produces.
John Dehlin's been around forever and he's worked really hard and he's created a space for disenfranchised members to get together and to commiserate, right? I believe they're wrong, but he's created this space. He's created value for these people where they feel like they want to donate to his cause. So it doesn't bother me one lick that he makes money because he's worked really hard and he provides value to people to the point where they're now donating to the cause. I think what does bother me and where money does complicate things is that does John Dehlin one day go, well, it's been 15 years. I've said everything I need to say. I'm going to step away. Probably not, because now this is his livelihood. So now it's a
Yeah.
content creation farm. And in addition to that, he is a life coach where he charges, I looked it up once on his website. It's like $150, $200 an hour to like coach people through their faith crisis, which is a huge conflict of interest. Again, I can appreciate that he's a soft landing spot for somebody going through something. So I can appreciate that element. But
Mm.
if you're creating the problem that then you're solving through, again, it's not therapy, it's life coaching, like that's a pretty big conflict of interest. And it's why likely he, instead of being a licensed therapist, because you can't have those sort of conflicts of interest as a therapist, he's a life coach because you don't have those same restrictions. And so creating, he's solving the problem that he created in a sense. And so that's the part where it gets complicated and yeah, you could see where the conflict of interest comes in, and you could see he has no motivation to stop, even if he said everything he needs to say.
Right, yeah, that's a fair point. I know
Yeah,
that, John or a critic would say we're just providing the information. It's just informed consent and it's people that are leaving. But probably what we would say is one, we don't feel like it's being fully balanced or really addressing the arguments or evidence in favor as well. And it's like if
right,
you be fully, balanced and informed people, take that into account as well. And for the most part, I feel like a lot of what's in your letter is either sort of strawmanned or ignored or just kind of dismissed,
right.
really. And I feel like if you are really about finding truth, then you need to take into account what everyone's saying, the evidence and arguments on both sides, and then decide for yourself. Um,
Right.
okay, so what about the Book of Mormon? What are some arguments or some points you made about the Book of Mormon? Why don't we start with naturalistic theories? You have a section on that.
Yeah, that's kind of how I start the Book of Mormon section is the naturalistic theories. Talk about the first book of Napoleon, the late war, view of the Hebrews, which is probably the most prominent, most popular one. The Spalding manuscript. So when the Book of Mormon first came out, I'm rolling up my sleeves now. Watch out.
Oh boy,
When
it's fighting talk.
when the Book of Mormon came out, the narrative was that Joseph was an ignoramus. This is just like a dribbling nonsense book, The Incoherent Ramblings of Some Upstate New York 23-year-old Farmer, right? That was kind of the narrative. And that worked for a time to poison the well of, don't read the book, don't even look at it, don't read it. And until people started reading it, and it was clear, wow, this is more complex than you would expect from a 23-year-old farmer. So then critics had to change their story to, well, somebody else must have written it. It wasn't Joseph Smith because he's stupid and ignorant and a farmer, but somebody must have
And
written
both
it.
friend
So
and foe, that's kind of Brian Hales in his article. Pretty much that's what everyone thought of him, friend or foe, that he seemed uneducated,
yeah,
not super intelligent. I think some people thought we're making him out to be stupider than what he was, but he
right.
wasn't
Yeah,
this genius to people.
yeah, and we do that too as members of the church. It's like Joseph was just this idiot. That's also not true either. But regardless,
I
that's
remember I
what.
had a companion who once said he couldn't read or write. He was that illiterate. And then I was like, and then I looked at it, I was like, well, he read James 1:5 before he went to the Grove of Trees, so I think he could read.
He couldn't read or write. That's amazing. Um, so uh, so then the critics had to shift to a new narrative that, okay, somebody else wrote the Book of Mormon who's more qualified. The leading theory initially was the Solomon Spaulding, who had passed away, that he had some book that was the Book of Mormon, that was his, book, unpublished book. That's what was believed. Or others said it was like Sidney Rigdon wrote it, or even Oliver Cowdery, or like Hiram Smith, like the other people around Joseph Smith who were far more capable and intellectual. They were the ones who wrote the Book of Mormon. So that was kind of the theory for a long time, particularly the Solomon Spaulding. And then when his manuscript found, when that was published, like 40 years, or found, I should say, in Hawaii, and then published like 40 years after Joseph Smith's death, it was clear that the Spaulding manuscript and the Book of Mormon weren't even close. I mean,
No.
they couldn't have been any more different. There was like maybe a couple loose high level parallels, but other than that, it was virtually had nothing to do with each other.
And even prominent critics like the Tanners and Dan Vogel would agree Solomon Spaulding
Yeah.
manuscript was not the source
Yeah.
or influence.
Yeah. Most sincere critics, it's not even in the CES letter. Most sincere critics acknowledge that that was a bogus theory. But that was the reason it's important, is it was the predominant theory for like 60 years, or I guess that was 50 years.
Mhm.
So for a lot of the church's history, this is what was believed was the source of the Book of Mormon. And some critics to this day believe that there was a mysterious second manuscript that we just haven't found yet. And I'm thinking, what are the odds? The first book was like a pirate romance novel. What are the odds that his second manuscript is the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
You're right. And so critics went through an awkward couple decades where they didn't have a very good theory, but then early in like 1902, and I'm spacing on the name of the author, but he's the first one who came up with the idea that Joseph Smith used the view of the Hebrews. So then that became the new wave, was that, okay, Joseph Smith was actually really smart. Like he had all of these books that he kind of pulled from to then create the Book of Mormon. And that's kind of the dominant theory today, is that Joseph was actually way smarter than we give him credit for. And he was able to kind of pull from all these sources to then create the Book of Mormon. So that's the like dominant naturalist theory today. So in the Light and Truth letter, I just go through that idea one by one: the late war, the first book of Napoleon, view of the Hebrews, and just even the Bible, right? He just copied the Bible, right? So I just go through it one by one, asking questions like, and I don't remember the word count offhand, but I view the Hebrews like 50, 60,000 words, let's say, something like that.
Yeah.
So if it's the source of the Book of Mormon, where did the other 200,000 words come from? Things like that. So, or like first book of Napoleon, like the CES. This is one of I think the worst arguments of the CES letter. It's kind of embarrassing.
It is
where
misleading.
They pull
very misleading.
Very misleading. It's kind of the smoking gun on kind of the manipulative techniques of the CES letter, but they take bits and phrases from like 25 different pages in the first book of Napoleon, and they compare it side by side with like a handful of pages at the beginning of the Book of Mormon to make them look like they're similar. But, if I could do that with two books, I could make any two books look like look similar. So it's a
And
very
between a lot of the
deceptive.
ellipses, there's sometimes paragraphs or even pages in between as well. So it makes no
Yeah.
sense that he would have used it as a source for the Book of Mormon.
There's some good arguments in CS letter. That ain't one of them. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just go into the different. So the predominant theory is that Joseph Smith collected all these things and created the Book of Mormon. So then I just dive into, okay, so how would that work? And so he had these books memorized. Did he even have these books? Is there any evidence that he read them, was familiar with them? Like where people say that he had no manuscript or sources with him. So how did he get them into the translation? So I just ask questions like that to undermine the theory that he could have just naturalistically come up. Well, obviously he just, he just borrowed it from the view of the Hebrews. And that's what critics do sometimes is they have to reverse engineer. We have all these like really interesting things that you have to deal with, but they start with this assumption that there is no God. We know that. So naturalist assumptions. So then they have to reverse engineer how Joseph Smith did this. Like there's really strong evidence that Joseph Smith had metal plates. So how did he get those metal plates? Right. And you have, oh, well, he was smelting metal plates and etching characters in between long hours on the farm. And you have to come up with this convoluted scenario that's actually pretty ridiculous in order to make that theory work. And that's how critics approach Book of Mormon creation theories is they create this scenario that's ultimately more unbelievable than Joseph Smith receiving plates from an angel.
I remember like whenever I was in my faith crisis, and I honestly think that I could probably, I hope this doesn't sound boastful, but write a better Book of Mormon section than Jeremy did if I were to criticize the Book of Mormon. I
Sure.
remember like
Yeah.
whenever I was out of the church, I was very convinced by like Grant Palmer's theory about like he was borrowing from the King James Bible, Protestant sermons, his own father's dream. They got into robbers is like anti-Masonic rhetoric,
Right.
the late war, and then just like he was a storyteller and just a creative genius. And like this is a quote from your letter, because one, I think there's some apologetic responses to that to answer some of those things. But the question you have is, if Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon, how did he dictate a complicated 580-page, 269,000 religious book, 697,000 word book with a compelling narrative, consistent geography, brilliant lectures, sermons, allegories, poetic structures in less than 3 months? How did Joseph dictate the Book of Mormon in 65 or perhaps 90 days in one draft with his limited experience in education? So you're asking like a lot of these questions, and like some people can really dismiss that, but like whenever I interviewed Brian Hales and looked into a lot of that, like it's not just like the time frame and the length of the book, but that's also quite remarkable. But it's also the fact it was like a creative oral dictation.
Right.
So he didn't even write it; like it was him dictating, looking at one or two stones in a hat without notes or manuscript. But then on top of that, it is like if he is making up, why so long and why like so complex with the geography, with the different calendar sisters, the chronologies kept very consistent, all the different plot lines. Like it is a very consistent and complex books. And I think sometimes critics can really dilute or minimize. I know I did whenever I was out of the church. I just thought like, well, those five different sources explain it all. And it's like it is actually quite miraculous that he was able to just produce that brutal
Right.
dictation in 2.5 months and it to be pretty coherent.
Yeah, when you have the critical lens, it's like, you identify these 10 parallels between the Book of Mormon and the view of the Hebrews, and you go, oh, that's how he did it. And then you're on to the next point. It's like, well, hold on a second. Like 10 to 15 loose parallels between a much shorter book and the Book of Mormon, like that doesn't remotely explain the connection. So that's kind of what the Light and Truth letter is doing. It's just like, well, slow down. Like you can't brush this under the rug. Like you have to like play the narrative to its logical conclusion, and that what you're proposing looks genuinely pretty silly by the time you've constructed it.
And it doesn't account for all the dissimilarities, and you even bring up as well. That's a good point. Like some people say, well, Oliver Cowdery's family, Ethan Smith was a pastor at the church, and he wrote View of the
Right.
Hebrews, so he brought View of the Hebrews to Joseph. But Oliver came after the loss of the 116 pages, so that theory doesn't really work because Joseph
Right.
already had the narrative beforehand. So I agree. I don't think View of the Hebrews is a a strong argument. I did at the time whenever I was first presented with it, and even a lot of critics, like even Dan Bogle, don't think it's necessary for a naturalistic theory. And I
Right.
like this one point you make is that critics, is it not fair to say that the Book of Mormon is at least an anomaly at the very least? So
Yeah.
even if like complexity or like the fact it was produced in like 2.5 months, okay, it doesn't prove it's divine or historical, but it does make it very rare. Like it's something like the average Joe, no pun intended, does not do. Like it would be
Yeah.
very hard to replicate as well. Like I think Brian Hill maybe presented like Pearl Curran, who was an automatic, writer. The automatic writing theory is maybe the only person that could have done something somewhat similar, but that does not explain the Book of Mormon. It's at least quite a rare thing to have happened.
Yeah.
Uh,
Agreed.
why don't we touch next very quickly? What were some like Book of Mormon evidences that you touched on uh, in that part of the Light and Truth ladder?
Yeah, I there's a section on like literary evidence, archaeology, anachronisms. And so some of the literary evidence, John Hilton III has an excellent book, Voices of the Book of Mormon, where he does basically a computer. So without computing power, it was hard to figure out like, because you could distinguish different authors. I give this example in the Light and Truth letter about A Double Falsehood. It's a play that was put out 100 years after Shakespeare's death, and the one who produced it claimed that it was written by Shakespeare. And without like handwriting analysis, like there's no way you could verify this claim that this, play 100 years after Shakespeare's death was actually written by Shakespeare. But with computing power, you can actually figure it out. You can create psychological signatures for your different authors. And what they found is that actually Shakespeare wrote Double Falsehood probably early in his career with Fletcher, who is somebody who he used to collaborate with early in his career. And you can kind of see the first three chapters are Shakespeare. The last two of this play and Double Falsehood is Fletcher. And then Theobald, who's the one who produced it 100 years later, you see his kind of editorial hand. And so with computing power, we can actually identify like different authors and voices and where they come in. And so John Hilton III uses a similar methodology, and he's able to identify that these different authors or writers of the Book of Mormon, they have very distinct voices. Like
Hmm.
Nephi says, "And my soul delighteth" 11 times, and no other author says that. And it's interesting because Nephi, in Second Nephi, he pairs off with Jacob, where sometimes it's Jacob, sometimes it's Nephi, and you see their distinguishing voices, even though they're chapters next to each other. You see their differing voices, and there's a couple images in the Light and Truth letter, but you can kind of
Yeah.
see clusters of voices in different places and how they're very different from Joseph Smith. And so that's a literary evidence that's really compelling to me. There's other literary evidences like Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, like chiasmus. There's the Udo-Aztecan connection if you're a Mesoamerican model believer. There's trying to think of other literary evidence off the top of my head.
I think you had the name Mulek in there and like ancient names as well.
Yeah, that's more archaeology, but it's
Oh,
also literary too. The reason
linguistic.
it's archaeology is because they dug up that clay stamp that talks about Malikayu ben Hamelech, which is Malikayu, son of the king.
Hmm.
And the reason this is archaeological evidence is that, and without pulling it up, it's Jeremiah something where it was translated Malikayu ben Hamelech. It was Malikayu, son of Hamelech, was how it was translated in the King James Version and other versions. But they found that
Yes.
that was actually a mistranslation, that is Malikayu, son of the king.
Yes.
Um,
And he's called
yeah,
Malachi, I believe, in the King James Bible.
yeah, Malchiah, thank you. And
Malachi
so,
on the stamp seal.
yeah, and Malchiah is just an English transliteration of Malikayu, the Hebrew. And I'm probably butchering that pronunciation,
We
by the
don't speak
way.
Hebrew.
Yeah. The reason this is archaeological evidence is that the Book of Mormon claims that Mulek is the son of the king. Well, in a different part of Jeremiah, it says that all the king's sons were killed. So that toast for Joseph Smith. Like he's claimed something that the Bible refutes. So how is this possible? Well, now we find out that there was a mistranslation of the Bible to insinuate that at least one of the sons probably survived, and now archaeological evidence to support that one of his sons survived. And if you take the consonants MLK, it's the same as Mulek. So Mulek could likely or potentially be, shorthand for Malikayu, just like Mike is to Michael. And so I don't. One of the non-Latter-day Saint scholars was pretty impressed with that connection. He said, "Oh, if Joseph Smith made that up, he did pretty good."
Yeah, it's a plausible
Yeah,
shortened Hebrew variant for that name.
yeah,
Which
it's not a bullseye. It's not like this is definitive proof. It's just one of those things. Like if a farm boy from upstate New York is making this up, like how is he getting stuff like this right?
mhm,
Or it's plausible, and that's kind of the whole point of the Light and Truth letter is how is why are there Egyptian names in the Book of Mormon? Right,
right.
Pahoran. Why are there Hebraisms at all? And you can't say that they're just all coincidence. I mean, some of them could be, but they can't all be coincidence. Alma 36, and
Oh, yeah,
so
that was a very intentional chiasmus. Whether or not you want to attribute it to a modern or ancient author, there's no way Joseph just put his head in a hat and just dictated. Like
yeah,
it's a beautiful and complex and carefully crafted chiasmus.
yeah. And then archaeology. It's interesting. In the Book of Mormon, we know that they left from Jerusalem, and then the plates were buried in upstate New York. Those are the basically only two data points we have. Everything else is kind of a mystery. So it's kind of interesting that First Nephi, which we know starts in Jerusalem, if you follow along in the book, it matches up really well with the geography, the
Really?
Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah.
The Frankincense Trail, and then Nahum, which is the big one, which I never heard of in church, by the way. Um, and then
I
the
don't think I did either, to
turn.
be honest.
No, I never heard it. No, I never heard that. The turn near east, then to Kor Kafut, which is a real plausible location for Bountiful, and it matches the description of Bountiful. So all of these details, these are all archaeological. So we know where the Book of Mormon happened, and it's like detail per detail, all lines up almost perfectly. That's really impressive archaeological evidence. Most of the rest of the Book of Mormon happens in some unknown place in the Americas, and so that's harder to pin down. But it's amazing that the first book of Nephi, it's like I mean, detail for detail, it's like accurate in almost every regard.
Yeah. And what I think is really fascinating, it's not just like any gem on an altar. Like it's in the right place, right consonants, but it's that eastward turn as well. And there would be burial sites there. It's dated to the right century. If we find the name Ishmael, that might make it stronger. Oh, and they have
If
found
only.
a tombstone called Ishmael. Oh, well, that could have been a popular name. That could have been a different Ishmael. Like what I find interesting when I talk with Neil Rapley about it, because he's kind of like the expert on
Yeah.
Nahum, as he was telling me, like back in like the 70s and 80s, like before they found the altar Nahum, that was in pretty much the right rough geographical area where scholars believe Nahum would have to be, just following the travel
Yeah.
locations and distances with Arabia. So it does match up really well. It's got the right constants, but what I found converged really well is that eastward turn to Bountiful, and critics would have just mocked Bountiful existing in the Arabian desert, and it meets the criteria. But for me, I find it's just how well the whole travel converges. And whenever I like watched, it was either Brett McDonald's video, and I might have watched the one by David Snell on like Old World Arabian geography. I was out of the church, and I remember thinking like, man, this converges too well for it to be a coincidence to me. I was convinced he must have had a map somehow, but there doesn't seem
Right.
any evidence of that. And look, if you don't think it's a bullseye, I think it at least converges very well together. And you can argue that the travel in First Nephi is inconsistent with Old World geography, at least. No, I think it's a good convergence. And yeah, like you're not saying like this is definitive archaeological evidence, but those things need to be taken into account
Yeah.
and steel manned as well. And you address some of the things like DNA and anachronism, at least some things to maybe undermine or maybe challenge some of those issues that are presented as smoking guns.
Yeah. I think the main thing with anachronisms is that when the Book of Mormon came out in 1830, there were only anachronisms. There were like 60 or so things that couldn't have possibly been. And then critics have added a lot more to that. There's some count that's of like over 200 now. And over time, more and more these anachronisms are falling away. And here's the reason that that's really impressive. We're talking about a 23-year-old farm boy making up what he purports to be history, and the details that he's purporting are proving more and more true over time. Like one of them being a sophisticated indigenous people. Like that was kind of ludicrous. Like people did not believe that because, the Native Americans, the Indians were just, people in huts and skins. And so for them to have like a sophisticated civilization was like really silly to those readers at that time. And
You even
and
had a
so
quote from David Whitmer. I think he says it better than
yeah,
we can. He says, now this comes from 1883, so I guess the argument a critic could make is, oh, it's late, but he says, so this is after, or his experience as one of the three witnesses seeing the angel in the plates. When we were
yeah,
first told to publish our statement, we felt sure the people would not believe it, for the book told of a people who were refined and dwelt in large cities. But the Lord told us that he would make it known to the people, and people should discover the ruins of the lost cities and abundant evidence of the truth of what is written in the book. And then you see with the book by Stevens and Catherwood about their travels in Central America that a lot of that wasn't known at the time in
right.
Joseph's day. And now we find so much evidence, especially down in Mesoamerica, of these large civilizations and cities and all these warfare and like these interesting correspondences with Mesoamerica civilization and culture with things in the Book of Mormon as well.
Yeah, and so it's an important point because archaeology in the U is messy in general, but it's even worse in the Americas. We have not done a lot of digging, but on top of that, sites like in Mesoamerica, they're not preserved as well as they are in the Middle East. They have like worse climate for preservation. And the conquistadores just destroyed everything, right? They destroyed books, they renamed cities. I mean, they just, like, the Aztecs were wiped off of the face of the planet in their history. And so the fact that there are 200 anachronisms levied against the Book of Mormon, and now there's only a small handful of them left, even though the archaeology is really messing the Americas, is really impressive. So critics will say, if there's one anachronism, that's it. I mean, you only need one, but we're talking about things that happened thousands of years ago in the Americas where we don't know very much. So
Yeah.
critics should feel really uncomfortable with the increasingly shorter list of anachronisms that, over the years. And so critics use anachronisms against the Book of Mormon. To me, it's actually a really faith promoting concept. And yeah, we don't know everything yet, but it should make critics uncomfortable that this farm boy from upstate New York in 1830 just came up with he just came up with them. He just figured it out. He just guessed it. Like that's an uncomfortable concept.
That was eye-opening to me that we've not archaeologically excavated all there is to find National Geographic's in less than 1%. So it doesn't mean that we're going to find all of these outstanding anachronisms. It also doesn't mean that we definitely won't either. And like
Right.
a lot of like the Mayan cities as well was like the classic Maya building upon the pre-classic as well. And what I find interesting, which I'm not going to say that it's super strong evidence, but again needs to be taken into account, and you talk about some of this in your letter, is some of the correspondences or convergences between Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon. And that's what I like about like Sorensen and Brent Gardner's approach is it was rather than saying like let's find the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, can we see things that correspond between Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon? I know some people take a Heartlander model. I lean more with Mesoamerica, but there's lots of things which to me seem to converge, particularly in like the warfare and
Yeah.
geology and things that just seem to like fit with the time periods and the civilizations and the population sizes writing that it's interesting that it kind of converges with the text. It
Right.
just seems less ridiculous over time.
Yeah, it's not, again, none of this is definitive proof, but it makes the story more complicated and more nuanced and more interesting than some critics tried to admit.
Yeah. No, I would agree. It makes it like at least more respectable and not like demonstrably, false or non-historical. Do you
Right.
want to say anything quickly on the witnesses? I've covered them a lot on my channel, but you had a good wee section on the witnesses as well. What would you like to say about the witnesses?
Yeah, I love some of your content you've put out on the witnesses. there are estimates say over kind of 200 accounts, first, second, third hand of what the witnesses said about the Book of Mormon. And essentially the narrative is consistent that they saw what they saw and they never denied it. There's 8 to 10 potentially problematic, like more second and third hand accounts that are coming from usually hostile sources. And they're trying to reframe that it was all just kind of in their minds. It was like this spiritual experience that they saw with their spiritual eyes.
Right.
The problem with that narrative is that some of those accounts came out while the witnesses were still alive, and they went to refute them themselves. Like, no, this is not what I said at all. And so they refuted it themselves. So imagine being, and I say this in the book, but imagine being a witness. You saw something miraculous and you sign on the dotted line that, yeah, this is my experience. And then skeptics for the rest of your life try to, did you really see what you saw? And they ask for repeated interviews, and you just consistent over and over and over. You say the same thing. And then somebody else says something that you didn't say. So now you have to do more interviews to say, no, 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 that's not what I said. I said this. And then 200 years later, critics are only pointing out what these second and third hand witnesses said. Like, that would be so frustrating as a witness of
Yeah.
the Book of Mormon. Like, you did, what more could the witnesses have done? Like, how many more interviews would have satisfied the critics? That's my thought, is like, what more could they have done to bear a faithful testimony than they did?
I like this question that you asked. It says, why do these critics use a small handful of problematic second and third hand accounts at the expense of the hundreds of primary accounts and the overall narrative? Is that what light and truth seekers do? And
Yeah.
I agree with you. Like, I remember at the end of the video I did on, I think it was the three witnesses, where I accumulated like 60 or 70 statements. And so many people at the end were like, well, this doesn't prove anything. All you've shown is that they believe they saw the angel in the plates. That proves nothing. But the point is like, we should represent their testimonies accurately and
Right.
collectively, and not just cherry pick a few second or third hand ones. And if you look at what they say, they just reaffirm over and over their official testimony. Like, they're absolutely adamant. And whether or not you want to believe or not believe, it's misleading if you just cherry pick a few second or third hand ones and say,
Right.
this is what they claimed. It's like, if you want to know what they claim, like, look at all their statements. And they're very consistent and emphatic. And as well, like, just, Joseph pulling off mass hypnosis, mass hallucination on the three witnesses, making a set of metal plates that pass visual inspection for the eight. Like, I know it's hard to believe in the angel and gold plates, but that's also like quite a thing for
Right.
Joseph to have pulled off statistically. And these guys, even after leaving the church, reaffirm throughout their lives till their deathbed, that they know that they saw the plates.
Yeah, the witnesses are very uncomfortable, and critics have to deal with them. And like you said, that I think the hypnosis theory is like ridiculous, but at least it's critics engaging seriously with the conversation.
Yes, I do respect Dan Vogel for that. Like, I feel
Yeah,
like it's the theory you'd have to go with. And at least he tries to account for the
yeah,
witnesses. Like, okay, Joseph made his own set of plates. He did it when he went to the hill. He hurt his thumb by bending the
yeah.
ring. Plates were covered
I
in blood,
respect that
which,
way more than just, oh, there was just their spiritualized clearly from these 8 accounts. That's what it was. And then you brush it aside. I respect Dan Vogel way more.
yeah.
I think it's ridiculous, but at least he's engaging seriously with the ideas and coming up with a theory that of how it could potentially work. And that's the flaw, is
Mm,
reverse engineering how it all happened. Because these witnesses definitely believed what they say.
yeah.
So you have to account for that. And so you have to come up with theories like hypnosis, hypnosis, and he made the metal plates despite
It's,
no evidence
yeah. And the statistical chance of all three having an audio visual hallucination that they never deny, and then him making his own set
in
of,
2 different instances, right?
yeah, like, it's possible, but it's quite statistically improbable. And as well, Joseph, promised or prophesied, if you believe he wrote the Book of Mormon, that they would see the plates as well. And that's just quite a thing to pull off, like, to replicate that. Like, that's pretty impressive. And when you listen to their statements, they're at least sure and adamant it wasn't a hallucination or a
Right.
trick or juggling to them. And it's obviously faith whether or not we believe them. I know we're getting short in time. Is there anything you want to say about, like, how did Joseph know? You have things like maybe quickly the Book of Enoch or connections to ancient temple rites.
Yeah, that I have kind of a smaller section. So there's a lot of this boils down to the Book of Mormon because it's the keystone of our religion. But there's just like other weird things in there too. And I call it the how did Joseph Smith know? There's Lehi and his sons are performing sacrifices, but they're not at the temple. Well, how is that? Because in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that you need to perform sacrifices in the temple. And then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 100 years after Joseph Smith's death, they find the temple scroll, which says if you're more than 3 days out from the temple, meaning you wouldn't be able to come back before the Sabbath, then it's appropriate to do sacrifices outside the temple. Um,
That's pretty cool.
how did how did Joseph Smith know that? Right. Um, Enoch, I think, is one of the most compelling corroborating evidences that Joseph Smith, like there was something going on with Joseph Smith as a seer and a revelator that I didn't hear about at all in church, by the way.
Me neither.
Where,
We're from critics. Me neither.
yeah, yeah, exactly. From critics either. Joseph Smith took 5 verses from the Bible and turned them into 110 verses. So this is just off the top of his head. And probably at the time, it was probably just the like blasphemous ramblings of a fraudster, right? He just took 5 verses and made them 110. Well, what's really weird about Moses 6 and 7 is it lines up disturbingly well with things that we would find out about Enoch years later, in some cases over 100 years later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, with
Right.
all the Enochic literature that's come out in apocryphal writings that Joseph Smith would not have known about or had access to. I mean, even things as specific as like the name of an alternate character, Mahijah or Mahuja, like that's wild.
Yeah.
Joseph in Moses, it says in the book of Moses, it says that Enoch was a lad. And we find that same phrasing in these apocryphal writings, talked about Enoch was a wild man, and you find that in apocryphal writings. The roar of lions and the roar of wild beasts, and the roar was feral. Uh, it's like some disturbing, again, if you're a critic and do not believe, there's some coincidences and correlations and parallels that are frankly troubling if you're not a believer. How did Joseph Smith know? Right.
Yeah. And I would recommend, I think Brett McDonald did great episodes on his series
Yeah.
LDS Truth Claims, and I did a recent interview with Jeff Bradshaw. And what really stood out to me was not just like specific names or specific language, but just like the themes and the storylines seems to fit as well, particularly between the Book of Giants and Joseph's
Yeah.
Book of Enoch, which he wouldn't have had access to. And I think the response from non-LDS scholars as well, they're kind of like, man, he had like charismatic accuracy and was like a religious genius. Like it really is interesting corroborating evidence for Joseph having this revelatory gift, and it's hard to account for.
It's
I've not
hard.
found a good naturalistic explanation for the Book of Enoch. That would be a
Yeah.
massive shelf. Any
Yeah.
others before we talk about positive
Uh,
fruits?
yeah. I was going to say, I mean, again, it's not definitive proof, but it's like, that's a challenging one for critics. And I don't envy them for trying to tackle that because that one's a challenging one.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. Fruits of the church. I mean, the letter is almost split in half. I don't think it is exactly on basically the truth claims of the restoration and then just how good the church is for you, for your family, for your community. Because in, I don't know, maybe the last 10 years, there's been this shift from not just that the church is false and not true, but also the church is not good. And that's been the recent development, particularly with like Mormon stories. All these people come on and share their awful stories with the church and how badly they felt hurt by the church. And so there's this increasing narrative that the church is like bad for you, like it's unhealthy for you physically, mentally, emotionally to be a member of the church. That's just demonstrably false. Uh, it certainly,
I think we both agree. It's probably there's probably some truth in some cases, so we don't want to fully delegitimize or invalidate some of those
yeah,
people's experiences, but often it can be almost weaponized that because I find that as I was listening to a lot of Mormon stories and hearing not just people's faith crisis, but traumatic experiences or bad experiences with leaders or being LGBT or being a woman in the church and feeling that like, man, this church is hurting people. It's like this corrupt
right.
organization, which was very much against sort of my lived experience. I think a lot of people's lived experience. And then you think, well, maybe I'm just privileged. I have white
Yeah,
privilege being a white, straight male. And I think I like how you point out in your letter that that seems to be a lot of like anecdotal experiences, and we should take those into account, but that is not what the majority of the data actually would support.
Yeah, what's frustrating was when a critic takes an anecdotal personal experience or an experience they heard of to then solve problems that don't exist, right? The church isn't systematically abusive. There are instances of abuse where either people who are members of the church are abusive, or a leader doesn't do enough to prevent abuse or report that sort of thing. These are anecdotal, personal, one-off examples. It's not the sign of a broader problem, and that plays out in the evidence. And so, members of the church, they live longer, their mental health is better, they our youth get better grades, they're less delinquent, we have lower divorce, less poverty, uh, more education in general, better socioeconomic status. Like, the list of measurable benefits to being a member of the church is, that's why I say demonstrably good for people, because, or I said demonstrably false, the inverse argument earlier, but in virtually every meaningful, like measurable data quantifier, like members of the church are doing really well, uh, including women, including LGBTQ plus member identifying members. And so this is a narrative I think we have let critics run with because we treat stories as sacred. It's your personal story, right? And so we treat that as really sacred, but it has this influence on us subtly where we start to think, and I say this in the letter, I'm like, man, maybe the church is like really bad for women. Like maybe I just don't understand, or maybe it's really bad for LGBTQ plus identifying members, or maybe the church is abusive. Like that's not my experience. So it's a lot of this. I haven't seen this, but I mean, I'm just like one dude. I mean, I haven't seen everything, obviously. Maybe I'm like way off. But the more you dig into this, it's like this isn't even what the image of the church that some critics portray isn't even close. So the reality is, again, my wife, can you find more light and truth? Well, on the truth side, again, this is not how I feel today, but at one point I felt like maybe it's 50-50. Okay. It's not 50-50 when it comes to the fruits of the church. Like members are doing really well, and it is good for us to come together and be Latter-day Saints. I'm some people have bad experiences, and I'm okay with that. We're all on our own journey, and I can't say that membership in the church is the best thing for everyone in every situation ever, but I am convinced it is good for us as a community, as a world, as a country. The church is a really good thing, and you and your family will benefit if you remain a member of the church or convert to the church. It'll be a blessing to you and your family.
Oh, I like that. No, and I even appreciated in that Jubilee episode, Mormons versus ex-Mormons, there was a question of, does the church do good or is it a net positive for good? And I appreciated that even most ex-Mormons or the ex-Mormons that were on there acknowledged that it is a net positive. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's undeniable the good fruits of the church. And even though people will criticize the church for its wealth and that it should be giving a lot more of what it has, and I think that's a debate that could be had, you can't deny the tremendous charitable and humanitarian good and aid that is given and the positive fruits that not just the church, but I think religion has for people in their
Yeah.
lives. You've shown that in the data and the surveys, and all of that was really interesting for me. That the purpose, the meaning, how it can actually help with like mental health and education and marriage and all those things. So I would love to talk to you more about it, but I know we're coming near the end. So I just have maybe two final questions to ask you.
Yeah.
As you've been navigating through, um, what have you found helpful, either resources, channels, podcasts? Like if somebody came to you and like, I'm in a real faith crisis, what would you sort of recommend other than your ladder, which would be a good maybe first starting
Yeah.
point? Where would you recommend people to turn to? What has helped you intellectually as you've been navigating through the truth claims, complex things in church history?
Mormonism with the Murph, baby. Uh,
Well,
I said it earlier. I meant it. I really like your channel because, again, I, and this is your, you know,
you're just buttering me up here.
no, 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 no. Again, you give fair voices to critics and to apologists and just treat these controversial issues with curiosity. And you're a faithful source, like you believe. So that's where you stand on all this. But I think you give fair weighting to some of these other voices. So, and I think it's really unique in this space where a faithful source that's giving kind of equal weighting to some of these controversial issues on both sides. So I do really like your channel, have for some time. I think I've donated to you before, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, thanks
Oh
so
yeah, it's a
much.
few months back, but anyway.
Oh, I really appreciate it. That makes me feel that's really kind because what my kind of hope is like in doing the channel, I at least want someone to feel like if they believe in the church, they at least kind of accuse me of like, you never covered this sort of controversial issue as
Right.
well. And I would also say, I think I really like Brett McDonald's LDS Truth Claims. It was one of
Yeah.
the first things I came across. I think his lecture series is brilliant. It's kind of boring, so you need to really watch it with notes. There's a lot in there. I think Church History Matters podcast, great podcast. I even think David Snell's Faith and Beliefs. I
Yeah.
listened to a fair few of them a couple of weeks back whenever I was sick, and I was too tired to read a book or listen to like a intellectual podcast. And he does good
Yeah.
stuff on there.
Yeah. I really like Brett McDonald's series. It's like 30 hours. But he treats it like a lawyer. So he's just saying, this is my own way of, I'm not a lawyer, so this is my own way of phrasing it. The church is on trial, right? The restoration's truth claims are on trial. So let's go through kind of the evidences for and against the church to determine, like, is this true? And he never claims that beyond a reasonable doubt that it's
Right.
definitely true, but there's a preponderance. I think that's a phrase. There's a preponderance of evidence that it's more likely true than not, is kind of his case that he lays out really
Is it
well. So
reasonable, probable?
yeah, it's reasonable, it's probable. Yeah, exactly. So I really like that series. There's Jeff Roundy's Latter-day Saint Q&A,
Yes, I like that one. I remember
which
listening
is
to it a couple of years ago.
yeah, that one's really well done. I like that one a lot. I wrote down some other ones. Evidencentral.org. It's part of Scripture Central. It's like, think of it like a catalog
There's
of
so
like
much
the different,
stuff.
yeah, of the like positive evidences for the church. I really like Mormoner.org. Uh, that's one where it's from the B.H. Roberts Foundation, so it's a faithful resource, but they address all or many of the controversial issues, and they really are fair to critics. Is one thing I really like
Yeah.
about it. They're not just brush them off as nonsense. Like, they really give the critics like a fair voice and weight. But it's a faithful resource. I really like that. What else did I write down? Interpreter and Fair. I think of those as like your scholar, like the landing spot for like the scholarly type. So I think of like Fair and Interpreter being like where you start, and then it gets disseminated out from there as like the
Like
core of the.
BYU studies and
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
then books, going to books of that can be like it takes a lot of time to read that, like the best books of prominent scholars, but there are also like if you really want to dive into some of these topics, those are really good first platforms to turn to, but sometimes reading some of the best books by scholars in the topic is also helpful if you're really trying to dive deep into some of these issues. But that
Yeah.
can be the tough thing when someone's in a faith crisis and when there's so many different issues, who has the time to read like 20, 30 different books or articles? And that's
Yeah.
why some of these platforms can be helpful to turn to where it can be presented in more of a condensed fashion.
Yeah. And that's why one of the reasons I wrote the Light and Truth letter is I felt like it was a good place in writing to kind of put a lot of these positive evidences down, because otherwise you've got 30 hours of YouTube videos to watch, or you've got all these different things. Like, again, that rabbit hole is never ending. But if you just need a concise one place to go, I hope that it's a good resource. It seems to be resonating with people so far. A couple books, and these are shorties but goodies. Faith is Not Blind. Again, that's like a macro view on like a faith crisis, as opposed to like talking about truth claims or anything like that. And one that sneaks under the radar, and this is, I think, one of the most important realizations I had about a faith crisis, is Who is Truth by Jeffrey Thane.
Oh, I've not read
Uh,
that.
okay. Have you've heard of Jeffrey Thane?
I've heard of him.
Okay. So he spoke at Fair, I think, 3 times. His whole shtick is worldview apologetics, where he and I have a mini section in the Light and Truth letter about one of his videos, but when I talk about like this lens in which I interpreted information, a lot of that's coming from Jeffrey Thane because the worldview is the waters in which we swim. And so you could have two people who say family proclamation to the world is doctrine, but then have radical different interpretations of what that means from there. Like, how is that possible? Two faithful members have totally radical different interpretations of family proclamation to the world. So he talks about worldview apologetics, how we all have some sort of worldview. And what I recognized after study and thought is that I had adapted a different worldview, and that greatly informed how I approached information. And so, yeah, that's flies under the radar. Like I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. And it's again another like macro, like it's more philosophical, seeing the big picture. But that was I don't know if it was an important resource in the moment, but it helped me kind of untangle my story and understand myself a lot better. So I highly recommend that. If you haven't, just search Jeffrey Thane Fair. He's got like 3 YouTube videos that are fantastic, or you can read his book, Who is Truth?
Love that. And I just want to say that I have really appreciated the work you've done. I really appreciate reading through your letter. There is so many things that resonated with me in light of the research I've been doing. And I think like when I compare it to like the CES letter, I feel like when I read the CES letter, that was sort of like where I was in my faith crisis, I would say 5, 6 years ago. The CS letter is probably a good illustration or representation of where I was, where my faith was at, all the issues I had with regards to the church. And I feel like your letter generally is probably more of a reflection of where I feel like I am now. And that like the purpose of my channel, it's one to try to be fair and balanced, look at the criticisms, look in the apologetics and faithful scholarship. But from a personal standpoint, it was, can I align the intellectual with the spiritual? And it's not that, and it's personal for everyone. And it's not that I expect every single doubt or issue to be resolved or to find definitive proof. But it was like, as I was reading your letter, it kind of felt to me that there are intellectual reasons to believe. You can actually make a compelling case if you want to believe that can support your spiritual experiences. And I said this before that I feel like as believers or apologists, if we're trying to find the truth, I feel like we can't just ignore or like dismiss, the CS letter or critical information. I feel like we have to confront it, take it on board, see if we can respond to it. But likewise, I feel like if you're seeking truth, I feel like, critics or unbelievers need to take this into account as well, take it seriously. And if you're not persuaded by it, then fine, but it needs to be taken into account. But I really appreciate what you've done in your letter and just recommend everyone to go check it out. I guess if I were to ask you one last question, if there's anything you want to add to that, what advice would you give to someone who's genuinely going through a faith crisis, who is wrestling, having doubts, who is experiencing that dark night of the soul, whether it be believing in the Book of Mormon, in the church, or in Jesus or God?
Yeah.
What would be some advice or recommendations in light of your faith journey and your story?
Yeah. You and I, and we in the church use this term faith crisis. And one thing I'm trying to do is push back on that phrasing because a crisis insinuates an urgent problem, something that you need to fix right now. And when we say that or we think that way, we play into the into the critic's hands of, our identity can collapse. I mean, almost overnight when we play into that narrative. So as opposed to treating your challenging gospel questions as a crisis, treat it with curiosity, with enthusiasm. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to learn more. And when you take the emotion out of it and it's just something that you're on a journey. A journey sounds a lot more fun than a crisis.
Mm,
And so I think that framing is really helpful. And obviously the framing of, there's weird things in the church, right? It is what it is. But can you find something that's more true and has more light? If so, I want to know because I've been looking for 10 years and haven't found it yet.
I love that. Well, Austin, it's been great having you on. Thanks so much for coming on to my channel. I recommend listeners go check out the Light and Truth Ladder. I'll put links in as well. I'll put links in if you want to hear more about his story or other podcasts he's been on. And maybe in the future we'll collaborate again. There's so much good stuff in it. I'll probably
Yeah,
utilize some parts of it as well in future
please.
episodes on different topics. And I appreciate the work and particularly your faith and all the insights that you've shared. So thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. And I just finished the audiobook, so that'll come out soon.
Oh, awesome. I think that'd be good for people to listen to as well. I was thinking I would love to read or listen to your book as well, so I might get that as well. And
Yeah.
listeners, if you enjoy this, give it a like, comment as well. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content, future interviews, and future topics and series. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Mirth. Take care. Bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Mirth. Take care. Bye-bye.